Okay, good morning, everyone. This is our second session for the Chief Technology Officer Summit. We had a great session this morning with Rishikesh talking about product-led growth strategies, how to make sure that your products are easily adopted by the industry and by customers. Right now, I'm super excited. There is a very new concept a very thought leadership concept for chief technology officers. I'm thrilled to introduce Vishal Sheth, a renowned business growth and transformation leader, who's going to share his insights on optimizing tech teams and processes with a methodology called flow state. Vishal, I'm so glad you're here to talk to us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about the idea of flow state at an organizational level. So I'm all super excited and ready to go.
That's great. You have such experienced background. You've worked for, Fortune 500 companies. You've worked for startups. You worked for many. Can you tell us a little about your background before we get into this presentation? Of,
Absolutely.
how did you get started? How did you come up with this concept? And give the audience some background before we dive in.
Absolutely. So I have, sorry, first of all, I've had a little bit of a cough and cold going on, so I'm under the weather. Hopefully you all can hear me okay. And I apologize for any coughing that I need to do in advance. But 25 years in the software industry, I have started as a software engineer. I eventually, about 7, 8 years in, I kind of moved into project management because kind of structure and organization appeals to me, a little bit OCD that way. And then over the years, I've run PMOs, I have built PMOs. I got introduced to Agile about 17, 18 years ago. And that's where I started thinking more in terms of efficiency and organizational throughput. And that's kind of got me thinking about how do you make an entire organization successful? There's a lot of moving parts. It's kind of like an orchestra, right? Everything has to rhyme exactly the same time for the outcome to feel melodious or exactly what the conductor wanted it to be. So an organization is kind of like that, right? It's an organization, or it's an organism that has so many moving parts. Everything needs to kind of be in lockstep with a common focus and a common goal. And so that's where the idea of flow appealed to me. And I'll talk more about it as we get into the presentation. But I've been kind of thinking more about how to take the whole idea of being in the zone, or what is also called as peak mastery or unstoppable state. How do you take that to an organizational level? Whether it's a small or large organization, how do you build things in so that the entire organization functions in lockstep and as a single organism?
Thanks for sharing that for the background. Well, without further ado, I'll hand time over to you, and super excited for this presentation and for this new concept that will help organizations build things better, faster, more efficient.
Appreciate it. All right. So without further ado, as you can see, and as I mentioned, the idea is to bring organizations or enable organizations to get to that peak mastery state, to the in the zone state. And this presentation is going to introduce some of the ideas of flow state and how they can be mapped to organizations. How are they similar? How are they different? What does it take to get us to that state for any organization? As I mentioned earlier, I've kind of been there, done that in terms of anything when it comes to enterprise software or software development in general. I've built SDLCs. I've kind of spent a lot of time thinking, coaching, agile, delivering product, which is important, right? It's one thing to be able to think through things and strategize, but you also need to know how to deliver. So I'm passionate about efficiency, feedback loops. Like the reason I've bolded a couple of things in here is because feedback loops, data-driven insights, Those are like the um, basic necessities in order to build hyperproductive organizations. Like I mentioned, it's important to look at end-to-end strategy, delivery, deployment, metrics, um, to ensure that an entire organization is delivering well and is hyperproductive. So basically the way I look at this is, what's the opportunity, what's going on, why, there's always been evolution in the software industry. One of the things that keeps coming up is, right, folks have done various studies, and what some of these polls have and studies have found is that when you have strategic and execution synergies, um, and organizations that can achieve peak performance by combining those things or synergizing those, they're able to boost productivity, their engagement levels, and innovation by significant numbers. And this is just an average, right? So some more than others. But the bottom line is, the opportunity is that most organizations are likely leaving significant value and potential on the table. And so how do we tap into that? How do these organizations tap into that? How do they achieve peak performance? By combining and synergizing strategy and execution. So that's the original thought process there. Now, in terms of, there's a methodology, or basically there's a framework in terms of how do you think about an organization and where the various states of an organization. I'm not going to go through into defining each of these, but as you can tell, as you would realize, formulation is kind of like the most basic step. Things are still chaotic and so on and so forth. Whereas as you kind of go up the value chain or the organizational state, you get better and better. You're able to execute really well, synergize really well, and deliver. The flow state or the mastery state, excuse me, essentially is what we're going to look at to say, how do most organizations get to that state so that they can then perform consistently in a really good way. I'm going to take a pause real quick and ask the audience to look at the chart on the right side, and honestly, as a CTO, as a leader, do a gut check. Look at, where do you think your organization might be on that spectrum? Are they able to deliver with a high momentum, but is that consistent, or is it once in a while, right? Or are they in a stable state where everything's just happening, but it's still not effortless? And so mastery, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but mastery will allow your organization to almost do things that are above and beyond, but effortlessly. All right, so with that said, we're going to jump in to what the definition of an individual flow state looks like. This was introduced back in the 1970s by a researcher named Mihaly. I will not try to pronounce the last name, but I can definitely explain the concept a lot better. So the idea is that it's kind of like the in the zone state, but there's a definition that says it's an altered state of consciousness in which the individual functions at their peak. And typically it's harder to get to, it requires preparation, but when you're in it, you know it. And so the idea was to take that and say, okay, how does this map to an organization? What would it look like if an organization was performing at its peak state? And so the definition that I would kind of put forth is that the collective state of an organization wherein it consistently delivers high value outcomes almost effortlessly. Now there's obviously some, at an organizational level, you want high quality in the outcomes. You want engagement within the organization. You want efficiency. You want ROI. So there's a lot more parameters in terms of what in the zone or mastery or flow state might look like for an organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. So hopefully this is clear. There's a concept of a individual flow state, and we want to kind of figure out ways to mimic that as an organization. Sorry. So one of the ways to look at it within the whole definition of individual flow states. There's some characteristics that people have identified. There's some necessary inputs. What goes into, what is the preparation required to get to your individual flow state? So the first thing is clarity. You need to know exactly of clarity of the goal. What are you trying to do? The next thing is this challenging? If it's too easy, then it doesn't feel fulfilling. So it needs to be challenging enough where it kind of pushes your skill beyond your comfort zone. You need to basically make sure there's no distractions. Similarly, and when you don't have distractions, then you need to be able to concentrate and have a single-minded focus on what you're trying to do. So those are some of the preparatory steps required before an individual can get to flow state. The column on the right talks about how to get to an organizational flow state, what are some of the things the organization might need to do, right? So again, clarity of goal is important throughout the organization. Everybody in the organization needs to know why we're doing what we're doing. The organization, should be looking to challenge itself or stretch itself beyond what's considered just average or normal. And basically there needs to be skills, allocations, training. You need to kind of continuously push the limits of the skills that your organization has and the individuals in the organization have. So there's various ways to do that. Distractions, right? Reduce distractions at all levels. Everyone should know why they're doing what they're doing, and it ties into the larger organizational goals. Similarly, like I mentioned on the focus side, right? As you set up some of these other things that are, the lack of, low distractions, high clarity, you then start kind of ensuring that your processes and the tools and what everyone's doing has a sense of purpose, has clarity and consistent direction. So this is the setup aspect. Now, this doesn't guarantee flow state, but this gets you on the right path to flow state. So let's kind of look at what does it look like when you are in flow state, right? So the first thing from an individual flow state, I'm focusing on the individual flow state as a starting point. Effortlessness, the fact that you're now you get into this zone where there's a balance between the perceived challenge and the skills, given that you have low distractions, very clear focus, you start feeling ease in terms of what you're trying to do. As you kind of get the sense of ease, of effort, the feeling of control starts setting in. As the feeling of control starts setting in, you start feeling more confident. And then that leads you to higher levels of productivity. Now, one of the things that an individual might feel in terms of productivity, you're not going to measure that typically. Whereas, so you're going to feel it, right? Most individuals that are in flow state will feel it. Now, if you're an athlete, yeah, you're going to see it, right? You're going to run faster than ever before, things like that. But the idea is it kind of gives you an intrinsic sense of fulfillment, which almost, it's a key aspect of self-actualization. So it happens in a spurt potentially, but it gives you that sense of accomplishment, pride, and being in the zone. Now that's an individual state. So those are some of the feelings and the outcomes in an individual state. Now, one of the key differences on the organizational side is you can't just feel your way through it. As an organization, you're spending money, you got to know that you're actually delivering. So yes, there's the subjective aspect, but you also need to have some objective measurements. So again, let's kind of start at, okay, you've done all the right things in terms of the clarity of goal, ensuring low distractions, ensuring that you're pushing the organization beyond its normal, skills limits, and you're basically, focused on what everybody knows what they're supposed to do. Now, that obviously there's a lot more to do, but that sets you up to get to the point where the organization is pushing itself beyond the comfort zone and delivering above average outcomes relatively effortlessly. As this organization feels more effortless, it will start becoming more predictable with a sense of control. As the predictability starts happening, then there's an opportunity to start looking at reducing waste, increasing efficiency, looking at higher levels of engagement and innovation with everyone participating. And so that kind of gets the overall productivity of the organization going. And that results in better engagement levels. And at the end of the day, every organization is about the people. Once the people are fully engaged and excited about what they're doing, it creates clarity of purpose, it creates engagement, continuous improvement gets better, you have better retention rates, you have better referral rates. They want more people to come and join their firm because they themselves love what they're doing. So the idea is it's kind of like a self-fulfilling thing where as you do more, you kind of get better, everybody kind of starts participating in it and you start getting into the flow state. One key difference I want to highlight. In individual state, typically, like I mentioned, is a feeling, is not typically is not measured, whereas an organizational flow state or organizational state of mastery, we want to be able to measure. So we want to be able to kind of along the way and continuously measure how things are, the outcomes that we're getting. So again, as I mentioned, it's all about setting things up. There's a lot of work that goes into that to set things up so that potentially the individual and similarly the organization can get to a state of flow. And then again, idea is at the organizational level, we want to have it as a sustained state of flow. We don't want to go in and out constantly. We want to be able to set it up such that it's a sustained state of flow. All right, so hopefully that kind of explains the concept, the idea, how we kind of extrapolate it to an organization, and what are some of the nuances or the differences at the organizational level. One other way to look at it, we talked about a gut check earlier in terms of where the organization might be in the overall state. There are some symptoms you can look at. And obviously, there's a bunch of them here. I'll kind of highlight or touch upon a couple without going through everything. But for example, are your margins improving year over year? An organization that is improving and getting better and challenging itself and working beyond its comfort zone, the margins should be getting better, right? Because they are doing things more efficiently, they're building all the right things. So is that happening? That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, does it have a single global prioritized backlog? In terms of, remember we talked about clarity of goal. The clarity is essentially, do you have a prioritized backlog of what you're going to do? And is it constantly groomed? Is it constantly available? Does everybody understand what that is and how they play a role in that larger goal? Do you have a scoring model? How does everything get prioritized? Do you have a product council? When it comes to deployment and delivery, what are your DRE metrics? Is it close to 1? What are your ROI? What's your timelines? Are you able to deliver your budget versus your actual spend? Do you have to end up spending a lot more in order to deliver what you planned? What's your ROI? So there's a lot, and then at the end of the day, like I mentioned, a lot of this is about your employees and the people. What's your retention level? What's your engagement levels? So look at these symptoms, pause for a second, after your gut check, look at these and say, which ones do you think you could improve upon? Because those are your potential symptoms of not being in flow or not being in your zone as an organization. Again, this is not the entire list of potential symptoms, but these are a really good start. So what could be some of the impediments? Now that you've looked at potentially what are the symptoms, what could be going on? And this is another way to look at those symptoms, right? Do you end up in a situation where you have multiple priorities in your organization? Do you have a governance body that ensures that everyone's working on a prioritized backlog? Do you have a lot of ad hoc change requests, right? Because what that tends to do is throw individuals and your teams off their game. Again, those are distractions. We talked about distraction earlier. So you want to reduce those. What are some other, for example, effortlessness, right? Effortlessness comes from having streamlined processes that everybody understands, everyone follows. If you have inconsistent SOPs, standard operating procedures, you're going to have different people doing different things. You might have multiple sources of truth, which is a very common problem in a lot of large organizations. If you have multiple sources of truth, there's going to be a lot of discovery and mismatches and trying to figure out what everyone's supposed to do. So when you try to have a holistic view or even integrations, you run into trouble. Again, that causes effort and friction. So how do you reduce some of those frictions? Are you looking at employee morale, right? I mean, you could have, some of those could be a problem. If the right setup isn't there, there could be low employee morale, attrition, things like that. So again, make sure the bottom line is keep an eye on your organization, take an honest look at your organization, and look for clarity, look for focus, look for distractions. And as you see those, there are a lot of symptoms that can tell you what's missing. The columns on basically the bullets on the right side pretty much talk about some of the things that could be affecting your outcomes. All right, so measuring organizational flow. How do you measure it? Now, this is one thing I kind of introduced when I introduced myself. I'm a huge fan of measuring rather than just using gut feel. I have listed a few of the potential metrics that any organization can use to determine how things are going. Again, it is not a comprehensive list, but it is a pretty good list. One thing I will say when it comes to metrics, and I've seen this in many organizations, there tends to be a overload of metrics, which overwhelms the end user, and a lot of the times the metrics are not reliable. So in which case, as an end user or a manager or management looking at those metrics, if you can't trust the metrics, if the metrics are incomplete or they are all over the place, it's very hard to gain insights to be able to make decisions or good decisions. And so everything reverts back to gut feel, which is what we want to avoid. Most organizations should be looking at this telemetry data, should be capturing the telemetry data, but just the right kind of telemetry. Not everything is super critical. At different levels, right? Different things matter at different levels. Beyond the metrics, there needs to be discussion about KPIs, right? Metrics just tells you a number, but what is the number you want to hit? Again, set a goal. There needs to be clarity about what the KPIs are going to be that the organization needs to look at various levels so that the organization knows that it's constantly improving. Again, there's trial and error. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, without data, you're kind of shooting in the dark. Data is your friend. Insights need to be data-driven. Decisions and actions need to be data-driven. As I've kind of said in the title, you can't improve what you don't measure. It's extremely important to measure what's going on. And don't keep changing the measures continuously, because then again, you don't know what your baseline was and where you are compared to the baseline. So always start with the baseline, continue to improve, and I'll talk more about it as we go. All right, so now that we've talked about the setup, what are some of the symptoms? What are some of the challenges or impediments? How do you measure some of the things? Let's talk about how do you fix things? How do you make it better? How do you improve things? Again, start with a simple question. These are very relatively objective and easy to follow. But how many of these do you do really well? Again, ask the question to yourself, which of these best practices are you very mature at? Is your organization very mature at? For example, do you have a objective scoring model when it comes to prioritization? Do you have an empowered product council that gets together every so often and ensures that there is a global single prioritized roadmap and a backlog for everybody to follow, which ties to the overall strategy? How do you minimize distractions? Do you have a single global change request process so that it's not ad hoc? Everybody knows what's happening. Everybody knows when things are changing. Again, do you have a structure that basically says, hey, yes, we're going to be flexible when it comes to things that are further out, but things that are closer in terms of timeline, those are sort of tight. We don't want to willy-nilly change things that we've already planned, that we already know what we're doing, that we've committed, unless obviously there's a major change. But that's kind of the exception to the rule. Effortlessness, right? As I mentioned, single source of truth. Those are some of the best practices. One of the things that I'll point out here in terms of, excuse me, it is very important for information to flow upstream and downstream. For everyone to know, to have clarity, as I mentioned earlier, to have focus. There should be structures set up so that at different levels, information is flowing that makes sense. So there should be high visibility, and it should be consistent. Communication should happen not just upstream to downstream, but also downstream to upstream in terms of data and the challenges and and the risks and the opportunities and the innovation ideas. Right? So it needs to be a constant information flow on both sides, with that kind of brings high clarity. Again, on the satisfaction thing, I'll say, again, I'm not going through everything here, but when it comes to rewards, celebrate the wins, celebrate the ideas, allow mistakes, right? Make sure that the organization introspects failures objectively, and it's not about finger pointing and blaming. Get down to the basics and say, hey, how can we make it better? There's a concept called the 5 why in Agile, so you can keep asking questions, you keep asking why, until you get to a point where you've identified the root cause of a potential challenge or issue. And like we talked about, to get to flow state, to get to in the zone, continue to push the organization beyond where it feels most comfortable, right? Push beyond the comfort zone. Anyway, so those are some of the things I'll highlight here. But again, I'm going to pause a moment, let you all kind of take a look at some of the best practices and how they tie to the various characteristics, the inputs and the outputs to get to flow state. Again, some of these you might be doing really, really well. More power to you. Great. If you're not doing some of those other items potentially, take a look at them. See what you can improve. But make sure you measure those as well. Inspect and adapt. All right. So in summary, as a CTO, as a upper level manager in an organization, there's always room for improvement. There's always opportunity to get better. It is a living, breathing organization, living, breathing organism. Lots of people, lots of ideas, lots of processes involved. So the journey of 1,000 miles will begin with a single step. Start with a gut check, an honest gut check at the organizational state. Where do you feel it is? Hopefully it's in a high momentum state or a breakthrough state, but take a look at where you are. Baseline the current state with metrics. You can't improve what you don't measure. Start with the baseline, identify the right KPIs. Don't drown in too much or too little data. The data that you look at as a leader, should tell you a clear, reliable story at all times. It should be dynamic. It should be refreshed on demand so that you know what's going on. You need to be able to trust the data, and then continue to use the same KPIs and the same baseline. You can add more to it, but be very careful and thoughtful before you remove stuff from it, so that you're not constantly moving things around. Adjust the KPIs, right? If you want to kind of push or challenge the organization, push the KPIs higher to move the organization towards more of a flow state, to become masters at what they do. Inspect and adapt, listen to the data, take the necessary action. One of the key things, and this is, I've seen this with a lot of agile teams as well. So the idea of inspect and adapt. There's a lot of inspection that happens, but the adaptation is the hard part. Building new habits, changing things, looking at them and saying, are we getting better? That's the hard part. So please make sure that you and your organization are set up to not just inspect, but also to adapt and then re-inspect and adapt again. And it's a journey. It's a incremental journey. And as you go through it, you'll find that there are champions, there are people within your organization that want to step up. Give them the forums, give them the space. Make it a visible team effort. Let everybody know that they're all part of this. Everyone's empowered. Celebrate their ideas, like I mentioned earlier, and kind of make it a collective journey. Make it something that's exciting and motivating for everybody. Be methodical. I cannot stress this enough. Getting to effortlessness, getting to predictability, everything requires setup. Even as an athlete, there's a lot of preparation. As an orchestra, there's a lot of preparation that goes into getting into a flow state and giving your best performance. So be methodical. Take the time to set yourself up, to be organized, to look at the best practices, to look at the symptoms, and start the journey in terms of how do we keep getting better. You have to be extremely organized. Expect change. So the idea is that going into the structure that you set up and the processes that you set up and the mindset is that, yeah, we're going to expect change because that's the nature of what we do, and we want to make the most of the opportunities that come around. So be responsive, be ready to be responsive as part of the DNA. So even the processes and the structure and the communication, the collaboration, everything that you set up needs to be built around that idea of responsiveness, that it's okay if we have to flex. And that's how we build our organization. Be patient above all. Some of these things, depending on the scale of your organization, might take time. And especially because you want everybody to feel empowered and to be part of this journey, different people will kind of get their buy-in or the aha moment at various times. So be patient, work with your champions, spread the word, get more people excited and involved. What I feel is essentially the path to getting to peak performance and to getting to your organization to the best state that it can be. And then becoming even more so mature so that other people are coming to you and saying, hey, how did you do that? So that's the summary for the story that we just talked about. I will kind of mention a couple quick things. I am excited and available to coach because I enjoy this. I'm passionate about helping organizations strategize and execute at their best performance. I would love to connect with you all on LinkedIn. I also have set up my calendar, especially for the attendees here. So feel free to kind of set up some time with me and we can kind of talk. No pressure, no obligation. It's just a way to connect and see if I can help. My goal, after 25 years of working in the industry, is to kind of apply the experiences and the knowledge and the insights and the best practices that I've learned to help companies harness this in the zone state or the mastery state or the flow state so that they can deliver measurable results and more importantly transform cultures so that this becomes not just a one-off thing but something that just becomes part of the DNA of the organization for long-term success. So that's my mission. That's part of the reason why, or that's the only reason why I kind of do what I do. I'll leave with a quick summary of how the approach that I take. I want organizations that I work with to become essentially self-managing. So I might start with what I call as a jumpstart phase, where we start with some Kickstarter metrics, we figure out the KPIs that makes most sense, we get the data, we baseline the data. We generate some dashboards. Based on that, we figure out what are some of the big areas where we can get some quick wins, what are some of the key challenges. As we implement those recommendations, we get into the accelerate phase, where we look at the top 3 business outcomes that the business is interested in. This could be, time to market, or it could be productivity, it could be employee engagement, it could be any of those things. So we focus on the most important ones that the organization cares about. It could be simply, hey, improving our margins. So then we look at the appropriate metrics, the KPIs to look at, and we again do the baselining and the data acquisition. We set up the appropriate dashboards. We start looking at insights from the acceleration phase. Again, we look at, obviously, provided the training, the documentation, so people understand what to do with those metrics, why they are there, and what's the purpose. Typically beyond that, I feel the organization should have enough experience at that point and should have leaders and champions that can then take them to the next step, which is essentially the idea of being able to self-manage. You're having quarterly reviews, looking at the next set of business outcomes that the organization is interested in, and then kind of continuing to improve that. I'm always available, but I also feel that it is important for organizations to become self-sufficient, self-managing, have internal champions, have people within the organization that have the buy-in, that have the interest, and that have the motivation to continue to push the organization to the next level. That's, in a nutshell, what I kind of wanted to talk about today. Hopefully, this was extremely useful and to you all. I would be, like I mentioned, I'm more than excited and happy to connect with people, because this is a topic that I enjoy. And happy to kind of, if you want to set up some time with me on my calendar, I'm happy to do that as well. Talk a little bit about your organization in confidence, right? I want to make sure it's clear that anything that we discuss is going to be confidential, and but I am very interested in helping organizations. With that, Steve, I think I can hand it over to you. Once again,
Yeah,
Steve, thank you so much for having me on as well.
Vishal, is great. Wow. I spoke to you before. We talked about it. This is fantastic. I very impressed. For sure, your consulting, this methodology will help many businesses. I had a couple questions that came from this as I was listening. You work with many organizations, American Express, others. What are the most common impediments that prevent tech companies from achieving the flow state? What are the biggest challenges you see out there from them being able to get to this acceleration?
Couple things come to mind right off the bat. Number one, multiple sources of truth. Fairly, again, what I mean by that is, if you are a CTO looking at the entire organization, typically what tends to happen is, yes, you will get your agile metrics and your scrum metrics and your team level metrics because they're all in Jira or Azure DevOps or Rally. But that's only a part of the data. What about your portfolio? What about your NPS scores? What about your year-over-year margins? There's a lot more data that is relevant, especially if you are a CTO or a high-level manager within the organization. Typically, it is very hard to have that end-to-end data that says, hey, where did we start? Where are we in the execution? Are we seeing the results that we expected from our strategy? Well, there's a lot of disconnect that happens because the data is hard to thread through, which is part of the reason why I said, right, it's one thing to have a lot of different data in a lot of places, but it is very critical, and that's one of the things that I help with, is to thread the needle to identify just the pieces of data that are relevant and the right kind of metrics and KPIs to help put together a picture that is consolidated and simple to understand and simple to then dig through. Yes, I mean, you can always drill through and get to the next level, but you need to be able to start at a very relatively high, simple 30,000 foot level and it should tell you a story. Those dashboards, those data, those metrics should tell you the appropriate story. So then you can kind of figure out, hey, what's my next step? So that's number one. The other thing, like I mentioned, is like I kind of, if you have, you might have an awesome strategy, but generally what tends to happen is that there's a disconnect between strategy and execution. What the individual at the team level is working on, what they believe is their goal, could be very different from what the overall strategy was or the direction was. It's kind of like, interpretations of the Constitution. You know, the writers of the Constitution had something in mind and they wrote it as clearly as possible, but the interpretations can be many. And so the idea is that there should be number one, a way to kind of track things from top to bottom, which are, again, there are metrics and things that you can do. There are best practices you can put in place, consistent SOPs, work instructions, all sorts of things that you kind of put in place. But that's another area where I would say I've seen a lot of gap. So if you have a great strategy, but your execution is not doing exactly what you thought. And the third thing that, again, big thing that also I've seen is fungibility. You have a lot of, amazing skills, right? Especially for CTOs. I am sure you have people in your organization that are wonderful, that are just amazing. You bring a problem to them, they know exactly what to do, what tools to use, and how to solve it. How do you then scale that skill across the organization? How do you, if you need to pivot, if you need to grow that, how do you do that? When you sign up for an annual operating plan, right, the AOP, every year you come up with, hey, here's what we want to do this year. But how do you know that you have the skills, what you can actually deliver against that? Do you have, so that's your demand, but do you have the supply of the skills and the right people and the resources and the tools to be able to deliver against that AOP? You can't go hire and fire people every year that you have a new AOP. What tends to happen in these scenarios is the organization, like let's say there's a team that is, great at, they're data scientists. But this year, because of the strategy, the way it's set up, or the AOP, you might not need a lot of that same capacity. What tends to happen is that the product or the team will continue to work on what they know because they're already in-house. But that may not be the most important thing to the organization. But you're not going to just keep firing people because the strategy this year says, hey, we need to do this other stuff. So how do you create fungibility? How do you move people around? How do you set up the right organization so that you can flex? So flexing is extremely difficult. Planning capacity every year is extremely difficult. Tying strategy to execution, extremely difficult. There's a lot more other things that, but I'll say those are some of the big ones. From an execution perspective, a lot of organizations are very mature. They automate. They have amazing CI/CD pipelines. So from that perspective, from a technology perspective, a lot of organizations are average and above average in terms of maturity. Some of them are just fabulous. But how do you tie the whole thing? It's one thing, like as I said right now, if you see my presentation, the first thing I said is build the right things efficiently. Yes, you want to build things efficiently, but how do you know they're the right things? If there's a disconnect between your strategy and your execution, yeah, you're building great things, but are they the right things? So.
Yeah, that's great advice. I know we got 1 minute left. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the audience that you haven't said yet? I mean, amazing presentation. I think this will be very impactful for many CTOs listening, but any last parting advice?
I will say, just be honest. Use your gut as a starting point to see where you are in the spectrum of your organizational states, of possible organizational states. And if you need to kind of, bring in, doesn't have to be me, right? Bring in a consultant or someone who's done, who's focused on organizational mastery. Do that. Listen to, give it a shot. Try, give it a start, and you will. And the second thing I'll say is measure. But you have to be very precise and you have to be very smart about what you measure. Data by itself isn't going to tell you everything you need to know. You need to have the right data to tell you the right story, to give you the right insights, so that you can make the right decisions for your organization.
Vishal, thank you very much. That was great insight. For sure, as organizations are looking to scale, prepare themselves to scale as they are leading, this is a process, procedures, a methodology, and advice that you can contract out and hire Vishal and his team to help you with. Looking forward to seeing this book when it comes out. I think it'd be perfect topic for a book for you to write. And hopefully this gets you some good ground for that. Thank you for those listening. We have 2 more sessions for the Chief Technology Officer Summit. We have one coming up, amazing, on scaling your AI business, and then growing your team, your engineering team. So stay tuned. Vishal, thank you very much. Thanks, audience, for listening.
Thank you all.